Hello there. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of our Asia program, Kissinger Institute, History and Public Policy program, I'd like to welcome you to yet another session at today's panel that's featuring our China Fellows. My panel, or our panel today, is taking a deep dive into China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the BRI, as it's called, it's a massive program of investments in some 138 countries, particularly in the global south. And many of the projects focus on energy, especially coal, nuclear, and hydropower. Now, today, to investigate some of the geopolitical, environmental, climate, and security issues linked to Belt and Road initiatives in the global south, I'm really excited to introduce three of the Wilson Center's Global Fellows, who I had the honor of working with. I didn't say mentoring. I felt like it was a two-way street between us for over the past year. And it's been quite a crazy year. And I'm sorry we couldn't meet face to face and I couldn't make you ladies tea, but we have this today. We're going to start out with Jessica Liao. She's an assistant professor of political science at North Carolina State University. And her project is China's green mercantilism and environmental governance. And she asked the question, a new Belt and Road to the global south? I think you're going to answer that, right, Jessica? And then we have Cecilia Hanspringer. She's a senior researcher at Boston University's Global China Initiative, which those of you who don't know, it's really kind of a hotbed of cool research that's going into BRI and energy. And Cecilia, I may ask you a little bit more about the other work that you're doing there later on. Her project for us was the environmental sustainability and China's hydropower development in Southeast Asia. And wrapping up the presentation portion of today, we have Lami Kim, who is an assistant professor of Asian studies at the U.S. Army War College, and she's an adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. And her project is called Nuclear Belt and Road, China's nuclear exports and its implication for world politics. So you get to kick back in Zoom land here or on your streaming webinar, and you're going to listen to us talking about the trends and complexities of China's greening or greenish diplomacy from Jessica, hydropower, complexity for sure, spaghetti, I think we talked about in our prep chat, of hydropower from Cecilia, and nuclear technology investments by Lami. So I will mute myself and I'd ask Jessica, could you share your screen? And then I'll also want to remind the audience that if you look on the webinar page, you can share your screen, Jessica, as I'm introducing. Okay. For people who are watching us live, please look at the webinar screen and you'll see that there's the Asian program Twitter and an email where you could submit questions. Please do submit questions. And because the presentations are going to just take us about a half hour. All right, Jessica, I am muting and it is all you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I want to say this project, like many others, faced lots of difficulties due to the pandemic outbreak. But the Wilson Center and the team of Asian Program and China Environmental Forum, particularly Lucas Meyer and Jennifer Turner, have provided consistent support and feedback and, of course, mentorship. I want to thank you all for this tremendous effort and help to move this project forward. And so far, from all the previous panels, we have heard lots of good discussion about China's foreign policy, specifically the Belt and Road Initiative. While most of the debate focused on its geopolitical implications, I want to bring your attention to a less discussed but important issue, that is BRI's environmental impact on the global south. My project was originally about BRI's environmental impact on Southeast Asia, but very quickly I realized BRI's impact was so profound that it affected the entire global south. So here we are. Let's start with these 4 ongoing or pending projects shown here. The first at the top left corner is Para coal-fired power plant in Bangladesh, with a proposed capacity of 1,320 megawatt and under the so-called clean coal ultra supercritical technology. And the one on the top right is Embu Hanutulu coal-fired power plant in Turkey, with the same proposed capacity and also using clean coal technology. Nonetheless, environmental groups estimated that during their lifespans, the two projects will emit over 200 million tons of CO2s respectively, and put hundreds of thousands of people at risk of high air pollution. The next at the bottom left is the $1.6 billion hydropower project in North Sumatra, Indonesia. Both Asian Development Bank and International Finance Corp concluded the project would severely impact the local forest ecosystem and threaten one of the world's most endangered apes. And the last one is Hinkley Point nuclear project in the United Kingdom, which is now pending due to problems with radioactive waste disposal, an issue that provoked opposition from environmentalists and local groups since the beginning. In addition to environmental concerns, all four projects also share something in common. They're all sponsored by China as BRI's green infrastructure. So this green labeling is not coincidental, but reflects China's recent push for a BRI-centric global environmental regime. We can see this trend at the 2017 and 19 Belt and Road Forums, where Beijing made environmental protection and sustainable development a key agenda and launched a variety of new initiatives towards this goal, including many high-profile financial plans. It remains unclear why green development becomes the new focus for BRI, and what policy actions have been made. What does China-led environmentalism what does China-led multilateralism in environmental governance and sustainable development look like? And also what challenges are facing China's effort in greening BRI? So while a green BRI remains in the making, this research aims to answer these questions. So my argument is that a green BRI illustrates the rise of China's green mercantilism, i.e. using state capital to build a China-led coalition centered on an issue of development and environment. My research shows that the Global South is the key target of many of BRI's green initiatives. However, I also argue that green mercantilism is more about economic and political interests than environmental benefits. Therefore, the Green BRI has been ineffective in promoting its stated goal of sustainable development in the Global South. In fact, environmental governance is often put on the back burner of BRI's new initiatives, especially at the implementation level. So my research starts with the general context of China's green mercantilism. BRI's green agenda is not only a response to external criticism on its negative environmental impact, but also it reflects China's domestic policy geared towards a green economy. What is distinct about this policy trend is that the state remains at the commanding heights and leads China's green capitalism and environmental diplomacy. So in realizing green mercantilism, BRI initiatives can be broken into three policy categories, and each of them face challenges in realizing sustainable development in the Global South. So the first is green foreign aid, including the South-South Climate Change Fund and other BRI-themed environmental funds for demonstration projects, climate mitigation programs, and training programs, including many in collaboration with international organizations like the United Nations. However, Beijing's green foreign aid has distinctive Chinese characteristics. For example, diplomatic goals often trump environmental protection as the policy priority, efficacy problems also exist in many green programs, such as requirements for Chinese content in procurement or trade promotion. Moreover, some green foreign aid was delivered in the form of surveillance systems for hydropower dams in Southeast Asia or training programs for environmental law enforcement, which seems to promote more of an environmental infused authoritarian state rather than environmental protection itself. Second, China also aims to promote green financial systems through two related regulatory movements. One is to promote environmental responsibility of Chinese firms working overseas. And the other is to promote a green Chinese financial system, mainly banks, but also bonds and other financial vehicles. In spite of tightening regulations in these two areas, China's overseas environmental protection remains lax in practice. The major problem lies in the fact that all the current rules remain non-mandatory and rely largely on Chinese banks and firms' voluntary action. Importantly, major Chinese banks have not yet adopted international best practice in environmental protection, and they relied instead on the host country principle, which is commonly viewed as a low bar. China's definition of green is also peculiar, which often means less dirty. Large-scale hydropower, nuclear, and clean coal, as we've seen earlier, are often labeled as green projects. Finally, BRI also aims to promote green trade and eco-friendly investment through various policy cooperation mechanisms. Still, this effort has its limit given the problems explained above. As such, China has continuously touted green but built brown in BRI countries. And this is illustrated by the data from Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, where Cecilia is at. As you can see from this graph, coal power plants and like on the left, and then the scale hydropower, the second highest bar here, account for about 80% of China's overseas infrastructure, of which most were commenced after BRI was announced. And in terms of geographic profiles, BRI's renewable projects concentrated on more advanced economies in Europe, North America, and some countries in Latin America. But projects of high environmental impacts are located mainly in middle and lower income BRI countries. And in addition to energy projects, other BRI projects also have immense environmental impact in various aspects, as this table shows. To conclude, in spite of growing efforts in greening BRI, China, with a mercantilist mindset, remains reluctant to make a full and real green commitment. So my time is running out. I can talk in more detail about the policy implications and some recent and more promising trend about green BRI in the Q&A. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your feedback.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Cecilia, you can start getting your PowerPoint up, but I actually before, so I didn't give you the, if you have questions, please start submitting them now, and I can give you the details how to do that. Email is asia@wilsoncenter.org, asia@wilsoncenter.org. And through Twitter is @AsiaProgram, all one word, okay? Program spelled P-R-O-G-R-A-M. All right, thank you so much. And Jessica, I already have a bunch of questions, but I'm gonna let Cecilia move forward. And I'd forgotten you had that slide from BU. We're gonna have a lot of questions on BU later, probably. All right, here you go, Cecilia.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you so much to the Wilson Center, Lucas and Abe for their programmatic support. It's been a really great experience being a part of this program. And I really want to thank Jessica for setting the stage for this discussion and really bringing a focus to sustainability and the environment when we're talking about China's overseas investment. I think, what I find really interesting is that myself and Lami will be talking about the energy sector, which I think is incredibly important for moderating the social and environmental impacts of the BRI. It's actually the largest infrastructure sector in terms of many ways of measuring how BRI investment is dispersed. And within the energy sector, the electric power generation subsector is actually the largest destination for Chinese policy bank finance. So electricity and power generation are extremely important. And I will be talking about hydropower, and Lami will be talking about nuclear, which I think it's also interesting. I know that all of the panelists, we've looked at coal in the past, which is where a lot of the discussion has been. But hydropower and nuclear, as you will see, are also major sources of environmental impact, and in different ways. Hydropower especially, I chose because it's often portrayed as this sort of low carbon, universally clean source of electricity, but we know that there are lots of local impacts. The introduction of hydropower infrastructure to a river system, especially through the construction of large scale dams and reservoirs, can have massive consequences for the local ecology and social systems, the well-being of local people. And this is at odds with how it's often talked about on the global stage as being low emissions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So China is now the biggest player in global hydropower development, and much of this development is happening in the greater Mekong subregion. So even within Southeast Asia, I want to focus on these 5 countries because they share, many of them share borders with China. They have a historical as well as ecological entanglement with China through shared borders and river systems. And so I want to just start with sharing a project that you may have already heard of. And this is the Myitsone Dam in Myanmar. And this project gained a lot of regional and international attention because of the role of a Chinese company in developing the project. And the project is essentially canceled, some might say delayed, and the Chinese Power Investment Corporation that was supposed to development continues to try to revive the project. But the Myitsone Dam would have been the largest hydropower station in the entire greater Mekong subregion at about 6 gigawatts of generating capacity. And it would have been located on the Irrawaddy River in northern Myanmar, not far from the Chinese border. And I think it's become really emblematic of Chinese presence, not only in Myanmar, but also in the region because of how many protests arose around the sort of development and approval process. And again, much of that specifically focused on the fact that there were Chinese developers, including the fact that in the agreement between the Chinese development company and the Myanmar government, 90% of the electricity produced from the project would be exported to China. And ownership of the project would not revert to Myanmar for 50 years. And this despite Myanmar having the lowest electricity access rate in all of East and Southeast Asia. So many of the protesters felt that the benefits of the dam would not go to local communities. And these kinds of terms about electricity export and ownership are not uncommon for cross-boundary hydropower developers in the Mekong region, raising questions about, the distributional impacts, who bears the costs and benefits of hydropower development, especially when overseas companies are involved. So for my work, I was really motivated to look with a comparative approach at the social and environmental implications of China's hydropower development in the Mekong region, and trying to gather data and using a data-driven approach to compare different types of cross-boundary involvement, and examining how the developers themselves portray and narrate their own environmental footprints. And so I started by trying to gather the best available data. Something that we do at the Global Development Policy Center at BU is provide open databases on China's overseas finance and investment. And so I really wanted to start with the best project level information that I could get. And for those of you who work on BRI, you know this can be quite a challenge. So I actually merged 4 databases from 4 different institutions to create a comprehensive list of hydropower plants in the region. And all of these data sets have varying degrees of sort of completeness with regards to the plants that they cover, as well as technological and financial information about those plants. And we can talk about this in the discussion, but there's a lot of issues with lack of standard names for these power plants. There's so many different languages in the region. And so, I'm happy to nerd out about data with you all later if you want. And so I found over 1,200 hydropower plants in the region. And due to time constraints, I've been focusing on the largest 100, but I think those largest 100 will also be the source of some of the most major environmental and social impacts. So largest in terms of their generating capacity. And from there, I identified the actors involved in the development of each plant, including the main developer company, the parent company, the construction company, as well as the financial arrangements used to finance each plant. And I just want to point out here that defining Chinese involvement in a plant or any country's involvement in a hydropower plant is extremely complex. You could have a Chinese developer for a plant that is receiving a loan from a Japanese bank, co-financed by the Vietnamese government. There are really complex arrangements. And so I tried to identify the company types and be really concrete about that. Although in the image here, I've sort of boiled it down to a binary of whether or not a hydropower plant has any kind of Chinese company involved in its development, just to show sort of the distribution of where these projects are and sort of the trends that you can see. So some of the early findings, I think that many people who work on hydropower in the region have heard this anecdotally, and I'm just confirming that hydropower projects with Chinese involvement tend to be larger in terms of not only their generating capacity, but also the height of the dam itself and the surface area of the reservoir. And so, obviously size is going to be highly correlated with environmental impact. As well as displacement, for example. And these hydropower plants are also newer. And this is also not surprising because, since the late 1990s, a lot of traditional hydropower developers like multilateral development banks and Western donors have really stepped back from large-scale hydropower because of concern about their social environmental impacts. So, the average year of commission for these plants with Chinese in 2013 compared to 2003 within this data set of the top 100 plants in the region. And so, this could indicate that perhaps there are newer technologies and other shifting standards over time, but I think it's really representative of the fact that China is increasingly the dominant developer of hydropower globally, and especially in this region. And so, it's also clear that some countries court Chinese partners more than others. So looking at the graph on the left, we can see that Thailand and Vietnam essentially develop all of their own hydropower plants. Whereas Laos is a bit more of a rainbow in terms of the number of developer countries. Here, I'm displaying the total capacity of hydropower plants in each country. And that, I think, is really representative of the Laos strategy of becoming the battery of Asia, and really expanding hydropower development there in order to export and have this sort of electricity export based model of development. But I also want to point out that there's difference in the in the patterns of cross-border involvement based on the type of company, as I mentioned earlier. So developer companies, if you're only looking at the project developer, you might see that China is heavily involved in Myanmar, but maybe not so much in the other countries. However, Chinese involvement in overseas energy sector is increasingly occurring through international construction contractors, also known as EPC, or engineering, procurement, and construction arrangements. So this is when a developer company may contract a construction company to come in and build it. And I think it's increasingly clear that who builds and operates the plant has a great impact on the kinds of environmental effects that you may see. And so if you're looking at the contractors, you can actually see that China has a much bigger footprint in the region, a much larger share of capacity in the hydropower plants in my data set. So when you're looking at the contractors, Chinese construction companies dominate hydropower projects in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, with some presence in Vietnam as well. And I'm just gonna end my slideshow and share the rest of my findings, just talking through them, so as to not overwhelm you all with visual aids. But as I continue to go through this data, I think it's clear just how complex breaking down these kinds of arrangements are, and how difficult it is to isolate environmental impacts. These are interconnected river systems, and if you build one dam and then you build another dam, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. The impact could be multiplicative, and effects can cascade through river systems. So I'm hoping to provide this data, make it available, and potentially work with a hydrological model to look at cumulative ecological impacts. I also think this is an incredibly important area to do case studies. And obviously the pandemic has slightly changed the course of my research in being able to do that. But I'm working now on document analysis and doing the best I can, because what I've been seeing is that Chinese developers of hydropower plants in the Mekong, they do tend to emphasize the modernizing capacity of clean energy and hydropower, rather than local displacement and ecological effects. And there's this big tension between the types of local narratives that Chinese developers give rise to, and the types of conflict that arise in the hydropower development, and then what the developers see as the kinds of environmental impacts that they would be having. And a lot of this comes from the experience of China's hydropower companies within China itself, which has lots and lots of hydropower and a long history of hydropower development in a similar mode of being portrayed as modernizing clean energy. I think another thing that I've been finding is that we also need to pay attention to Vietnam and Thailand as other major cross-boundary hydropower developers in the region. Vietnam and Thailand are also building a lot of hydropower plants in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. And they also tend to have strict electricity export stipulations for the energy generated from those projects, which could give rise to similar issues and conflict. And so the question is sort of comparing the Chinese developers to other cross-boundary developers. I would also mention Japan is involved, and to a lesser extent, South Korea. And then finally, hydropower is not the only way to meet the growing electricity needs of these countries. I think, more research needs to be done to identify low cost and reliable electricity planning options. For example, taking advantage of the great renewable energy potential in the region that could reduce the need for a lot of these planned hydropower installations. And I think here there's an opportunity for the US to reconsider its role in the region. There are existing and new partnerships between the US and the Mekong region, such as the Mekong-US Partnership and the Japan-US Mekong Power Partnership, JUMP, that are increasingly focused on energy infrastructure. So this is an area, I think, where the US can offer concrete policy options and even alternatives to large-scale hydropower, and that these can also help US renewable energy developers go overseas. So I'll end with that thought and looking forward to the rest of the panel. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. Before we switch, I wanted to ask one quick question. In terms of the Chinese dams, because you mentioned how the Thai and the Vietnamese dams are, they want to have some of that energy come back to them. Are you seeing a pattern? Is most of the electricity that these planned dams or under process dams are where's the electricity going to go? Is China still wanting to bring some of that back to Yunnan, where I thought we had too much hydropower already? Or is there a trend on that, or 还不知道?
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to get a sense of how many of the hydropower projects have these arrangements where the electricity will be sold abroad. For the ones that I can find information on, it's typically back to the home country of the developer. And the developers are usually Thai, Vietnamese, or Chinese, on the scale of 70 to 90% of the electricity going back. So yeah, a lot of it is planned to go back to China. It's a bigger issue of whether or not China actually needs that electricity. So we can talk more about that, yeah.
Great, and I see that Lami has leapt into the whole opening up her PowerPoint, and thank you very much. And so Lami, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. It's my great honor to be here today, and thank you all for joining our panel. What I'm going to talk about is China's ambition for nuclear exports, which I call the Nuclear Belt and Road. Nuclear exports are an important component of China's Belt and Road initiative, but hasn't received much attention, relatively speaking. So in my presentation, I will argue that the Nuclear Belt and Road has potentially damaging impact on the US and the world. And please note that the views expressed here today are mine and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the US government. Okay. China is rising as a nuclear power. It is now the world's third largest nuclear energy generator, only after the United States and France, and is expected to become the largest nuclear energy generator by 2030. And China has heavily invested in nuclear technologies, and it has developed homegrown nuclear technologies, its own intellectual property rights, most notably Hualong 1 nuclear reactor design in the picture. And based on its large domestic nuclear industry, as well as its homegrown technology, China is aggressively pursuing nuclear exports to other countries. It has built several nuclear reactors in Pakistan and is financing the UK's nuclear reactors that Jessica showed earlier. And China is aiming to build as many as 30 nuclear reactors abroad by 2030. Although China is a relative newcomer to the global nuclear market, it is on track to become the dominant actor. China can build nuclear power plants on schedule and within budget, which is not very easy to do. And most importantly, China's generous financing offers to cover the enormous amount of upfront costs, like billions of dollars, makes it a very competitive vendor. China offered, for example, 80 to 85% financing to Pakistan and Argentina. And while China is rising, traditional vendors, nuclear vendors like the United States, are not doing so well. And Russia is the only other country that is providing financing, and is currently the dominant actor. But China's enormous financial strength gives it a competitive edge, especially when financing is often the most important element in choosing a nuclear vendor for developing countries. So why does this matter? What does the nuclear Belt and Road mean for the United States and the world? First of all, the nuclear Belt and Road will affect global nuclear governance. As China has a bigger share in the global nuclear market, it will also have more influence over rules and norms. Therefore, China's stance on nuclear non-proliferation norms matters. And until the 1980s, China was critical of the non-proliferation regimes and helped Pakistan build nuclear weapons. But starting from the 1980s, China joined the key international non-proliferation regimes. And in light of that, some have argued that China has become a sincere advocate of those norms. But my research suggests otherwise. What drove China to join these regimes was not its embrace of the non-proliferation norms, but its interest in foreign nuclear assistance. When China began to pursue nuclear energy in earnest in the 1980s, it didn't have the necessary technology and so sought foreign nuclear assistance, especially from the United States. China was particularly interested in Westinghouse's pressurized rotor reactor. But China's problematic nuclear track record served as an obstacle. So taking this opportunity, the United States particularly asked China to join all these regimes as a precondition for its assistance. And China joined these regimes for that reason. And China's behavior since then hasn't always met the standards of the non-proliferation regimes. First, China has provided controversial nuclear and missile assistance. Second, China's private companies continue to proliferate banned items in its domestic nuclear export regulations, but Beijing doesn't appropriately punish them. Third, China has been reluctant to impose and enforce sanctions against non-proliferation non-violators such as North Korea and Iran, and it even helped them evade the sanctions. Last but not least, unlike the United States, China doesn't take proper measures to prevent recipients of its nuclear assistance from developing the capacity to produce nuclear fissile materials that could be used for nuclear weapons. So the bottom line here is that if China hasn't embraced the non-proliferation norms, China may undermine the existing norms once it enjoys dominance in the nuclear market. And the nuclear Belt and Road may expedite the power shift from the United States toward China. Due to its sensitive nature and large-scale long-term operation of 200 years, nuclear cooperation deepens relations among states. For this reason, states have used nuclear exports as a strategic tool, but China's nuclear exports will offer particularly strong strategic benefits because they will heighten already high dependency, economic dependency of developing countries on China. That's dangerous because we know that China is not very shy about wielding its economic clout to achieve diplomatic ends, right? There's a myriad of examples of that. And also, we can't rule out the possibility that China will threaten to suspend nuclear fuel supply, which will serve as a strong leverage. Also, China offers a great amount of financing to unsustainable degrees. And if some recipients of China's nuclear exports fail to repay the loan, China may seek to take over strategic assets in return for debts, as it did in Sri Lanka. So all of this could undermine the US's position in its power competition with China. Lastly, on the impact on the environment. The nuclear Belt and Road could help to tackle climate change because nuclear energy is carbon-free. However, that will be the case only if nuclear facilities are operated safely. There are concerns about China's nuclear safety standards because China is simply not transparent about its safety records. And China has poor track records in general industrial safety, which is rife with rash planning, corruption, and careless construction and supervision. So China has one of the highest industrial fatality rates in the world. And safety concerns are greater for China's overseas projects. Even within China, safety standards are higher in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai than other parts of the country. It's not hard to imagine that safety standards applied abroad may be less stringent than those at home. Also, the fact that recipient countries have lax regulations and lack necessary know-how and personnel to handle the items safely adds to the concern. So as such, the nuclear Belt and Road potentially has negative implications for the US and the world. But it is not too late for Washington to thwart China's nuclear ambitions. The United States should try to enhance its competitiveness as a nuclear vendor, for example, by putting together attractive financing offers in collaboration with other countries. And the US should also make diplomatic efforts to eliminate the danger of China's nuclear exports. Recently, it seems like the US's efforts worked in Romania, which canceled its nuclear deal with China last year, and instead decided to work with a US-led consortium to build 2 nuclear power plants in Romania. So I'll be happy to talk more about this case in the Q&A session, but I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Lami. So what these 3 women just did for you is they put out it's like putting out bowls of candy, enticing you to take a nibble. So that nibble will come in the form of you guys emailing and tweeting in your questions to asia@wilsoncenter.org or @AsiaProgram for the Twitter. All right. But in the meantime, I of course have questions because I wrote them up ahead of time. Yay. But hopefully more will come in. It's really sad, again, not to have people in the audience to leap up and grab the microphone, but here we go. So thanks again for all I've got lots of questions. I'm going to go with some of them that I initially prepared, but I'm going to add a few more. So be flexible, ladies. So thinking about like that, both, there's kind of from within and without, China's feeling some pressure to green their Belt and Road. I mean, we know that Xi Jinping, he set that ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2060, which has set in motion some interesting changes and increases in power in China. The Ministry of Ecological Environment, I think that all of you maybe saw that just this week, there's a Minister of Ecological Environment inspector group. They issued a very strong report against the National Energy Administration. I've never seen anything like it before. They were criticizing them for ignoring climate change and pollution issues from expanding coal-fired power plants domestically. So this is really encouraging. And I think Jessica, you in particular, and then Lami, you also talked about this too, about the question of enforcement on the Belt and Road. Maybe start with you, Jessica, thinking about, do you think that we're going to see the Ministry of Ecological Environment kind of flexing their muscle on the Belt and Road? And if not the MEE, who can give pressure or incentives for, start seeing some of the greening of the BRI? I know there's a lot of different groups. There's some Chinese groups, some international NGOs, but I want you to start, giving me some of your thoughts on that, and the other 2 can jump in as well. Jessica? Make sure you unmute. Yeah, I know. It's like, and I will mute so I don't interrupt you.
Okay. Yeah, always forgot about that. So my observation is that there is always a consistent gap between the Chinese environmental law at a domestic level and the environmental law at an international level. So although the critiques has been, putting on pressure of the authority in the domestic level, it is still hard to predict how much of that pressure can actually spill over to, the authorities' regulation on the overseas area. So particularly on MEE, the Ministry of Ecology and the Environment, its authority in regulating BRI activities has been overshadowed for a long time by other ministries, particularly the Ministry of Commerce, National Development and Reform Commissions, and state-owned essays supervision administration commissions. And all those ministries or commissions have prioritized economic or export interests and uphold a more mercantilist policy view, like my presentation was talking about. So on the other hand, there are also, financial regulators such as People's Bank of China and China Banking Regulatory Commission have been playing an increasingly bigger role in demanding higher environmental standards for Chinese development banks, for Chinese developers to be responsible at home and abroad. But still, their influence often cannot reach policy banks, such as Export-Import Bank of China and China Development Bank, two financial pillars of BRI that are directly under the State Council. So as long as these more powerful and higher tier ministries remain unready to close this regulatory gap for Chinese banks and firms overseas environmental practice, greening BRI will remain a daunting task. But
so you're not,
there is.
Go ahead. Sorry.
But as Jennifer rightly observed, many within Chinese ministries and think tanks and civil society have been advocating for closing this gap and using a higher environmental standard for BRI projects. So last year, there is a proposed traffic light system to restrict Chinese firms' financing access depending on environmental impact of industrial categories. And it has, again, endorsements from officials of many ministries mentioned above. And this plan, if implemented, would be a game changer.
Who, if it's a traffic light, who's the policeman or woman blowing the whistle?
So, and this is something that is really unknown, but the proposal is being proposed by NEE.
Okay.
And of course, it needs like a collaborated effort and consensus to approve, especially put it into implementation. And for now, it's still in the implementation, in the evaluation stage. Yeah. We still don't know. And the key is really about implementation. And this part, and at this stage, we still don't know the latest status and what other ministries are thinking about how to move it forward.
I'm sure that there are a lot of Chinese international kind of think tanks and NGOs have their fingerprints in terms of, because there have been a lot of conversations going on about this. There's this kind of consortium of these kind of groups, I think the BRI Green Partnership, there's a lot of them. Right. So I want to make sure that the audience understands. Oh, go ahead.
And also another thing is about green incentives. We're talking about pressures, right? So you need stick and you also need carrots. And so how about green incentives? I forgot to mention that. So I think currently China relies primarily on regulations in encouraging its banks and firms to be environmentally oriented. But real financial incentives for renewable or green BRI projects is meager, if not non-existing. Mm-hmm. Yet at the 2019 Belt and Road Forum, a study group on Green BRI Development Fund was created. Although its latest status remains unclear, if the fund was established, it would provide much needed incentives for green BRI projects to expand.
At least maybe some of the smaller, we know that we didn't talk about today much, but like the private companies that do renewables, because they can't
exactly.
Hop on the Belt and Road with they don't have that big bundle of money like the SOEs do.
And also a very difficult part of those small private sectors that you mentioned, they really need support for very critical financial support like state guarantee and those financial support that cannot be provided unless there is a special fund to help them. And that is something that is lacking in China's financial system at this stage.
So maybe pivot over to you, Cecilia, in terms of this question about within China kind of movements to green their dams or, looking more at the local impacts. Do you see any movement? And I mean, because there's a lot of organizations, you got your Stimson folks, and I mean, so many organizations are active in the Mekong region, getting conversations. Even Chinese NGOs have worked with, stakeholders in Laos to talk about these issues. What are you seeing, or what do you think we could see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of similarity between the trajectory of hydropower development within China and then what China is doing overseas. The Mekong River, does go through Yunnan province, and there have been a lot of really similar controversies over some of the same companies even that are now developing in the Mekong region or the lower Mekong region, trying to dam like the New River and places like that, leading to similar issues of displacement and so on. Obviously, looking at projects like the Three Gorges Dam or, the North-South water transfer project, clearly the dominant model of development is massive scale infrastructure and willingness to shape the natural environment. And I think there hasn't been much responsiveness to that in terms of overseas development. There are actually some what you might call micro hydro or small scale hydro projects that Chinese developers are involved in the Mekong region, which would have less environmental impact and don't need to necessarily create a dam or a reservoir to generate electricity. But I think there's still questions about how those, who's benefiting from those projects and what their cumulative impacts might be on a river system. Yeah.
And Lami, I want to ask you this because you right near the end of your talk, you brought up the question that the countries where China's building these nuclear power plants, maybe they don't have a nuclear power safety commission. Because I remember back, I've been at the Wilson Center for 21 years, and I remember that early on when I was kind of around when the DOE and they were all starting to do exchanges and talk to the Chinese about, and our own nuclear power commission, setting up how China sets up their own. Do you see, if you're saying that within China, the nuclear power plants are better regulated in the big cities than not, who could be from within China to regulate the nuclear power plants that are going up overseas?
Oh, sure. So yeah, but what I meant about, when I was talking about Beijing and Shanghai, I wasn't really necessarily talking about nuclear power plants, but in general, but I need to make it clear. In general, safety standards are higher for large cities, big cities like, Beijing and Shanghai. But when you go to the second tier and third tier cities, then the standards are not that high. But when it comes to China's nuclear exports, sure, developing countries, this is really concerning that developing countries do not really have the experience and necessary experience and regulations that are necessary for managing the atom safely. And when the United States and some like-minded countries in France, Japan, and South Korea, when they go to when they export their nuclear reactors, they require, especially the United States, they require these countries to join relevant international regimes and establish proper regulations and safety standards. But China doesn't necessarily, China's projects, contracts are very opaque, and I am also trying to learn about the exact conditions and deals, but I don't know how successful I will be. But it is concerning for me. I'm not really sure if China will put a lot of emphasis on those regulations, and because China is not transparent about their practices, even for its domestic nuclear power plants, that gives a concern. Just to give you one example, when nuclear experts in the United States, France, and South Korea and Japan, when there are smallest problems in their nuclear power plants, they report it to the IA, International Atomic Energy Agency, so that everybody can learn from it and share experience, so that we can, use nuclear energy safely. But China doesn't do that, for example. So.
Okay, that's rather sobering. But in some ways, I'm almost seeing this, and some of what you three have just talked about as a real missed opportunity for China. Right? Because Jessica, you said they're pushing the green BRI, which is, they're usually talking about the hardware, but I'm thinking the software. China has, by leaps and bounds over the last decade, they've really made improvements of their own environmental governance system. And we're not going to say it's perfect, but we are occasionally seeing bluer skies over Beijing, and again, the Ministry of Ecological Environment has got a little bit, they're not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but they're getting some muscle. So just kind of tossing that out there, missed opportunity. But speaking of opportunities, we have a new administration in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, that they have been prioritizing climate policy, and not just a standalone, but in, a lot of people who are climate watchers are encouraged that in the US, we want to interweave it in a bunch of different sectors. So it becomes like, the air we breathe, so to speak. Now, I think it's happening right now. I don't know what Biden and Harris administration have stressed, that they want to get more involved in global climate issues. And I was curious, from the research that you three have done, do you think that you could see that, should the U.S., I don't know if this is crystal ball or you want to be prescriptive. Do you think that the U.S. can or should prioritize competing or cooperating with China in some of these energy, nuclear power investments? And so start answering that. And we're starting now to get some questions from the audience. Remember, audience folks, it's at Asia Program or asia@wilsoncenter.org. So my question about maybe started off with Jessica. So let's keep it short because we're starting to get more questions. And unmute yourself.
This is my longest answer, actually. I'll try to keep it short. So I understand with today's political climate, any policy between the US and China tends to be seen as whether to compete or cooperate. But policy options in reality often fall in between. So I think that the new administration should see beyond this dichotomy and think about what we, America, agree or disagree with China on its BRI practice, and what areas we want to see change the most, and how to harmonize Chinese views and standards with the international ones. And to do so require both pressuring and persuading China. And importantly, though, the US needs not only to focus on China, but on BRI countries. This means more assistance financially and non-financially for these countries to realize renewable and green projects. And for that, the Biden administration also needs to work with other creditor countries in making concerted efforts. The goal is to create a race to the top. I think an entry point to do so is about the global regime on export credit agencies centering with the OECD countries, which in a long time holds a higher environmental standards, higher than China's policy banks, for example, and including a recent ban on the coal-fired power plants below the ultra supercritical grade. And China has been keeping an arm's length from this regime. I'm not saying the OECD's regime is perfect, but instead I believe the global environmental governance on export credits will be ineffective, if not impossible, absent China's participation. So to conclude, it is time for the US to reassert its global environmental leadership to make up for the past 4 years.
And so how about you, Cecilia? Dams. What do you see that the, is there a new opening for the US role in Southeast Asia? How could we engage better or more? And just so you know, I also, Courtney Weatherby from Stimson sent in a question. Do you want me to read her question now too? And you want to answer them together?
Sure, I'll try.
Okay, so I'm going to bring it up here because, well, it's kind of a statement of question, but real quick here. Courtney Weatherby from Stimson says, I wanted to follow up on some of the great analysis that Jessica and Cecilia did on China's involvement in energy projects, as both of them had flagged China's strong support for fossil fuel projects and large-scale hydro as compared to new renewables like solar and wind. Can either of you comment on the way that this has evolved over time, particularly since the green framing for BRI started taking off in the last couple of years? I'm particularly curious about your thoughts about how the recent BRI investment report 2020 indicated that investments under BRI dropped overall this past year, but renewables drew 57% of BRI investments in 2020. It was a weird year, so maybe that explains some of this. Do you have any thoughts about whether this was a one-off or whether this trend will continue once the regional economy starts to recover from COVID-related slowdowns? So it's not just US, but so did you get that? Okay,
yeah.
So maybe Cecilia, do you want to say if you can weave two together? And
yeah, definitely.
Then Lami, we're leaping over to you.
Yeah, I also find it really interesting that we're always framing the US-China relationship in terms of cooperation and competition. I mean, when it comes to electric power sector, the US has essentially already dropped out. So there's no competition. You know, the US isn't involved in hydropower in the Mekong anymore, at least not to a significant extent. And China has, you know, definitely become the go-to developer for electric power around the world. The US isn't really even in the picture. You know, there was some amount of resurgence of US finance for overseas fossil projects under the Trump administration, and Biden has pledged to end that. But I think it's less about becoming a competitor in the energy sector with China. That may not be in our best interest, but rather on promoting, I think, where there are competitive advantages for the US, such as our renewable energy industry. So I think it's really interesting that both US renewable energy companies and Chinese renewable energy companies are struggling compared to their fossil counterparts to go overseas. So this could be some kind of policy, you know, race to the top for the respective governments to unlock more renewable energy investment, which, you know, can be a very reliable and low cost way to help other countries meet their energy demand. But, you know, in terms of the types of you know, energy technologies that China is financing over time. Yes, 2020 was a very strange year, but if we look, you know, over the next decade, you know, the composition of planned power generation projects that China is financing is not really different from what it has been in the past. You know, I think in the past, at least, you know, our database, the China's Global Power Database that was referenced earlier, shows that about 11% of capacity that Chinese development banks and companies have invested in since 2000 has been in solar and wind. And you know, everything that we look at that's planned or under construction, it's only 12%. That's still solar and wind. And so, you know, there are these blips, but I think to Courtney's question about, you know, the trends in finance over time, we are seeing this dip in development finance, but that's only for development finance. There's also a lot of commercial finance that's happening and a lot of direct investment by Chinese companies, which I'm sure, as you know, is really difficult to find data on. So sort of the composition of that finance is changing over time. So yeah, I recommend you all check out Courtney's research at the Stimson Center, as well as our database bu.edu/CGP.
Yeah, because there are two hubs of great information on this. Jessica, you got a one finger, and then Lami's going to start talking a little bit about her predictions or thoughts for the US. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney, for the feedback and the question. I also learned greatly from Stimson and a lot of her insights on this subject. And just have a side note on this. There is a latest report on Green BRI Center, which is, you know, one of the major think tank in China and leading this Green BRI initiative. It was talking about like what happened with 2020 and is this a long-term trend? I think there is a mixed message actually coming out from 2020. Yes, that's right. We see like the, you know, skyrocketed trend of like renewable projects coming out. But in terms of like the growth, you still see like the major chunk of the development project is still in fossil and hydropower. So that means this is promising trend. Nonetheless, the structural change is still, you know, not there yet. So yeah, we're hoping that COVID can be like, you know, a pivoting moment for renewable to catch up.
Okay, Lami, what do you have to tell us about the US side?
Sure. So with the United States backing the Paris Agreement and the more countries pursuing the carbon neutrality, I think that more and more countries will try to pursue civil nuclear energy to, especially developing countries, to meet their increasing energy demands. And so that will open up opportunities for both China and the United States and some other nuclear vendors. And I think that, well, I don't really think that China and the United States would like to collaborate with one another in this regard. They are just too different in terms of what they want, the financing scheme and all these things are too different. However, I think that the United States has there's a prospect for the United States to compete with China in the nuclear market, especially if the US collaborates with other countries? Well, the United States had a monopoly in the nuclear market until the 1970s, but today it accounts for only 20% or less. But still, the US has good technology and also especially it's very strong in safe operation and management of nuclear power plants. But just that American companies are not state-owned companies, and so it doesn't offer, strong financing. And so I think that's why I suggest that the United States should work with maybe some countries that could construct nuclear power plants at a more affordable price, like Japan and South Korea, and come up with international co-financing.
So Lami, I'm glad you mentioned Japan and Korea, because what's fascinating that just in the past year, we have both Japan and Korea saying that they're not going to be investing in coal-fired power plants overseas, in the near future. I guess as part of Korea also has a carbon neutrality pledge, right? I think everyone has it. It's quite the trend these days. Do you think that Japan and Korea will, be kind of shifting more of those resources towards nuclear power then?
No, unfortunately, South Korea, this current Moon Jae-in administration decided to phase out nuclear power.
Oh, as well. Okay.
Yeah, and so the goal is to rely more on natural gas, but ultimately, you can't do it. You can't phase out nuclear power without using coal, right? And so that is concerning. And Japan also, after Fukushima, scaled back its nuclear industry a little bit, but Japan also doesn't really have good alternative options, so they will have to rely on nuclear power. But as Cecilia said, I'm concerned about this trend, not only in South Korea and Japan, but also in Germany, to phase out nuclear. I mean, not phase out, but like reduce nuclear energy and then energy mix, and then rely more on coal.
Yeah, or gas.
Yeah.
Cecilia?
Yeah, I think the case of Japan and South Korea are also really interesting. As you know, I wrote a blog post with
Yes, you wrote it.
Program comparing
that was like
the three countries.
Yeah.
But I think this has all been happening so quickly, just over the past few months. I feel like there's been a sort of a competition on the carbon neutrality goals, right? China was first to announce carbon neutrality by 2060, and then Japan and South Korea came out not long later, carbon neutrality by 2050. And so the fact that I think it's been a number of specific institutions within Japan, companies and banks, that have ruled out coal financing, right, rather than a full government statement or something like that, whereas South Korea's has been more a part of their Green New Deal as like a government policy, meaning that some companies are still involved. So their relationship with their overseas coal funding, I think, is less clear cut than their domestic climate goals. And so I think it would be nice if China, decided to start to, want to compete policy-wise in terms of overseas coal financing. But I think until the message becomes clearer from other countries around the world that are involved in overseas coal, like Japan, South Korea being the major ones, but also the US increasingly with the Biden administration's announcement that we discussed earlier, that will create more pressure, I think, for China to maybe have some kind of high level commitment to the composition of its BRI energy investments. And I know Jessica already discussed how bureaucratically challenging that will be. It really has to come not from these ministries, but from an even higher level.
Yeah, because when we talked about like BRI, when you look at the map, it's like spaghetti. It's just like a big mess, and who's in charge is a big question. I want to ask Lami one more question, then I'm going to open one for all of you again. So Lami, what I think maybe some people listening that aren't as familiar with their nuclear power investments, they might have been surprised that, number one, that China is so big in this space, but and you hinted that they do it because they're very fast, they've got excellent financing. But I was kind of curious too, are there some innovations in China's nuclear power plants? I know that, I don't know if these are the ones going on the Belt and Road, but I've seen, little pictures of China having these floating nuclear power plants, or some of them are like Legos. You could just, that's why they build so quickly. I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because in some ways, we're keen on them being safer as well as the management, but the hardware itself, from a climate perspective, if we're embracing nuclear power, this could be a good contribution, right?
Well, yeah, that is true. China has, I have to say that China's development of nuclear technology is pretty remarkable. It has developed a new generation of nuclear technology, as I mentioned, with its own intellectual property rights. Well, that is true. And then, but then just to briefly mention, the floating nuclear power plants they are more sort of for like military purposes, actually, because China is planning to deploy those up to 20 floating nuclear power plants to in the South China Sea, because China is claiming its rights over those disputed islands and is expanding civilian and military infrastructure there. And then in order to do that, China needs energy, right, to support its oil and natural gas exploration, also to provide electricity and fresh water, because China is trying to move people over there too. And so it is that purpose. The PLA actually is funding that program, so that has military motivations. But China is also developing small modular reactor, and I think that in that area, the United States is more advanced, but China is also developing it pretty rapidly. But it hasn't been developed yet. It's not complete, but the pricing, according to one source, pricing is pretty amazing. China can offer it at a very, very low price, which to the point where I was really little concerned about, how can they make it so cheap? And so, yeah, but we'll have to see.
I'm glad you talked about pricing. I wanted to just kind of wrap up maybe a question last question from me that could kind of all of you could maybe touch on about in terms of the financing and costs and things. So you gave us a few insights there, Lami. So Jessica, you had, greenish financing was one of your 3 pillars that China has for their green BRI. And I was kind of curious if you could give us an example where this, because you gave examples at the beginning that they weren't really green. Coal-fired power plants are not considered green, even though the ultra supercritical coal-fired power plants that China has domestically and they're building abroad are much cleaner than anything we have in the United States, right? But I was curious if you had an example. It's true. I mean, they use less water and they're more efficient. They use air cooling, so it is cleaner, but we won't have an arm wrestling match over what's clean and not clean. And that I was kind of wondering if you had an example where you thought that China is really their green financing is being successful, true green. I mean, I've been reading, we had the folks from the Climate Bond Initiative speak a couple of years ago, where China their standards were that coal-fired power plants were green. They may be moving away from that. I just wonder if you had any last story on the green financing.
Sure. So I will talk about this both at the financial level as well as the project level. So that is right. China is now the world's 2nd largest green bond market, with the growth rate continuously holding strong. So in general, Chinese green bonds issued offshore are often more in line with the international green standards than those issued at home, which still account for the majority of Chinese green bonds. But still, there are some offshore issued a green bond that is financing the BRI projects, such as some wind farms in Pakistan that was issued by ICBC. There was some inspiring, this it's almost like the case studies, about the real green, projects coming out from China's green bond. But still, this is just 1 or 2 cases for now. Such projects such as clean coal were still account for the majority of those the green bond or more like the climate mitigation kind of project. But then last September, after President Xi's pledge of carbon neutrality by 2060, China dropped clean coal out of its green bond categories. Yet, how extensive this change might apply to other part of the Chinese financial system, primarily the banking sector, remains highly contested among the regulators. So we don't know how far this new change will apply and affect the other part.
And Cecilia or Lami, do you have anything you want to add from your area because I mean, we kind of touched on a lot of these before. We did get another question that we kind of touched on, but I wanted to give a, Harley Balzar at Georgetown. She said, I realized most of the research for these presentations had to be done BC before COVID. Can you talk a bit more about what you might expect after COVID? So you kind of, China may have reduced resources for foreign projects. Will this be a time with less attention to the regulations? And then I want to add on to that too. You guys did your research for us, BC and during C. I'd like to get a sense of where you three are going to take. You are China fellows, and I want to get a sense about where you're going to go, because I know you're all very sad that you didn't get to do a lot of in-country casework. But yeah, so let's maybe start backwards, maybe with Lami.
Yeah, it is unfortunate indeed that I couldn't do field work last year. But I wasn't really planning to go to China because, it's very difficult to acquire information, especially about the nuclear industry. But I was planning to go to those recipient countries that are in negotiation with China so that I can learn more about the deals, the nature of the deals. And so, yeah, well, the effect of COVID on nuclear Belt and Road, last year, I think that, like everything else, everything was, this nuclear projects were frozen in many countries. But I think that this year, for example, Romania is now planning to build nuclear power plants. And I think that, but more related to the carbon neutrality, I really think that more countries will jump into this nuclear market. And I am excited to learn more about that.
Okay, so you're going to keep you are going to physically trump on the Belt and Road eventually in the coming year or so. Good. How about you, Cecilia?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's hard to predict what the effects of the pandemic and economic recession will be on China's overseas investments, but I think there's been a really clear trend domestically that, given a choice in how to recover, say you could call it the green approach or the brown approach, China very much went with the traditional, near-term infrastructure approvals as a way to boost economic recovery, especially in coal, which is really interesting because there's already a big coal-fired power generation overcapacity problem within China. And I think the big headline coming out just in the past few days is that we know now that China put almost 40 gigawatts of new coal-fired power capacity into operation in 2020, which is more than 3 times the amount that the rest of the world did. And so, there's this big tension with the 2060 carbon neutrality goal, and then the reality of how China is choosing to, recover economically. And so the question is, how will their overseas investments play into that? I think it's still an open question. I'd love to hear what the other panelists think. As for my research in COVID, this was, very much something that I had wanted to be fieldwork based and case study based, and instead shifting to things that we can do from behind the computer. And so just, here's a time to really, double down and try to collect some data. But I think that, going forward, like I mentioned, I would like to expand, both the what I can do with the data as well as, confirming some of these findings with case studies. I know Jessica's in Beijing, and it's a very different world there in terms of being able to talk to some of the decision makers in this area. But I think my goal would be eventually to go to the Mekong region, and I'm especially interested in talking to, people who work at these Chinese development companies in the region, again, to see how they're narrating sustainability. And there's some, it's somewhat possible to do that virtually, but I think as a social scientist, it's much better when you can go in person. And I think that we're all missing our connection with colleagues in the field these days.
But you did have time to become your total data nerd, right? You were able to play around with your data more.
One good thing.
Anything that you want to add about a lot of us that do China work, there's always a question of where's the data, but the fact that I'm seeing up in Boston University that you guys have some pretty good maps up there on Chinese BRI. That mainly export import and China Development Bank. Anything to add about the trends there?
Yeah, kudos to my team at Boston University. We have 4 databases, and as Jennifer mentioned, just in December, we launched a spatially located data set of China's development finance around the world and where it overlaps with protected areas like biodiversity, hotspots, and indigenous lands. And we also have 2 databases specifically on the energy sector. And you're right, our forte is more in tracking development finance, which, as we discussed, has been declining, but there are definitely other types of Chinese engagement overseas. I talked about the EPC companies, which I'm tracking in my own research. And our China's Global Power data set actually also tracks foreign direct investment, which is a large and growing trend, and a lot of it is more towards renewables rather than the coal and hydropower that we discussed earlier. So those are all things you can see in our data sets. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So, and Jessica, what's your thoughts about the
Okay.
BC and right? Yeah,
Yeah.
AC.
I know a lot of people are talking about 2020 as the year of before and after. And in terms of COVID factor for how that would be possibly changing China's overseas development trajectory, there are some trends that I want to go back to, the other important players in this area, Japan and South Korea. We see previously we're talking about there's 2 countries last year announced they are going to stop their export credit support for coal power plants. And it did add pressure on China. But don't forget, this announcement came amid a pandemic outbreak, which pushed many coal power, not just Chinese, but many coal power plants overseas, across the world, already plagued by financial distress, closer to bankruptcy. So we're seeing some kind of trend of race to the top. Exim Bank of China and also China Development Bank have been cautious about further lending to this project and have since not added any new transaction to this sector. So, and that is also my feeling, my sense when I talk to folks working on this issue inside and outside the Chinese government, that, what Japan and South Korea are doing and announce have a lot of impact and influence on the decision makers there too. But still, I think the structural problem, i.e. the Chinese financial system itself, as well as the host government's, continued lacking of environmental regulations, they are fundamental problems that the COVID itself did not change. And we will still see this kind of push and pull factors continue to gravitize the environmental, development into a more brown kind of spectrum.
All right. Well, I think, ladies, imagine an audience going, yay, standing up, lighters. Well, no lighters. You can't do that in the Wilson Center either. It's not a rock concert, but unless you're for the China Environment Forum, this is a rock concert for me. I want to thank you all for your research and you were great fellows. But I know that you're not going to just leave me in the dust, that we keep in touch, because I hope there'll be more opportunities to bring you back. Want to tell the audience that at 2:30 today, there's a global norms, governance, and Chinese policymaking panel on this channel. Make sure you ask questions. And I have to do a plug for next week, the China Environment Forum. Besides doing climate and energy work, we've been diving deeply into ocean plastic issues. And next week we have a meeting called From Sea, SEA, to Sea, SEE, From Sea to Sea, how satellites can help identify and combat plastic marine debris. So that's with the US government and other researchers using satellite technology to track plastic moving around the ocean. And there's a lot of these kind of, it's another example of the USG getting involved in some global environmental issues, even before. So thank you very much, everyone. And so again, tune back into the Wilson Center at 2:30 for the next meeting. And I want to also thank my AV team for making it happen to get us out here so we can give this talk to you all. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.